My name is Hirsch Jain, and we have a great panel here today, a bunch of excellent speakers to talk about local ballot measures. So in the interest of time, let's jump into it. We'll start with some short intros and we'll go in alphabetical order. So Jackie, Jessica, Sabrina, and then I think Sean is just about to join us. So I'll let each of them give just a super quick intro and then we'll jump into it.
Hi, my name is Jackie McGowan. I am the founder of Green Street Consulting, as well as a very popular Facebook group called California City and County Regulation Watch, where for the past almost 5 years now, I have been tracking 482 cities and 58 counties regarding cannabis regulations, and it is the go-to spot to stay current on all of your cannabis regulatory needs in the state of California. However, we are on a temporary break while we are organizing a boycott of CCIA.
Thanks, Jackie. Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica McElfresh. I am a cannabis regulatory lawyer, and I've been doing that for a bit over a decade. That means I focus on state and local permitting, and during that time I have also wound up working on several ordinances and ballot initiatives, including a few that have become part of local law. So that's what we'll be talking about.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Fendrick. I'm the Chief Public Affairs Officer for Berkeley Patients Group. And prior to my time at Berkeley Patients Group, I was at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws.
Cool. Thanks, guys. And I think Sean is going to join us in a second. I'd like to just jump into it, and I'll start with Jessica. And so, Jessica, as you know, there are 26 different ballot measures across the state, more than we could talk about today. I've listed them in the chat just for people's reference. But I'm hoping, you know, of those 26, I know you've worked on a few of them. I'm hoping you can talk through maybe specific initiatives you've worked on that you think are relevant, and then to talk more generally, given your involvement with ballot measures, about the drafting process, the approach, what potential pitfalls are, how to interact with local officials. So there's a lot there, and I'll let you take it where you will.
Yeah, that is a lot, but we'll try to keep it simple. So the one I'm the most familiar with and have worked on for this cycle is going to be the Encinitas initiative. Encinitas is a small coastal, largely suburban town in San Diego County. And what we're trying to do there is it's primarily to allow a limited number of retail outlets. We do allow some other uses as well, but it's primarily for retail. And I think that generally with the initiatives we're seeing through the state, they're probably going to generally be falling in three categories. One is going to be, let's have retail. The other is going to be, let's have production uses and pretend retail doesn't exist. And then you're also going to see a wide variety of tax measures. Generally with the standalone tax measures, they've probably or potentially been put on by the local government. In Encinitas, for instance, we're not addressing taxes. From there with initiatives, you're going to be getting into sort of what type of tax. Are we going to be talking a sales tax, something that would resemble an excise tax, a per square footage or a percentage base of gross receipts or net or something type tax? We've seen them all. And then I think another major issue that you have to deal with in every initiative is how is the permitting or the regulatory process at the local level going to work? Is it going to be by right, meaning you find a property that works with the zoning and you go down to the counter and they give you your permit for a building? It's never quite that simple, but that's the overall theory with by right. We also see a lot of conditional use permit or major use permit, which is a more traditional way in California of allowing a land use that may have some conditions that need to be mitigated. Parking is a common example. It could be odor, it could be where you're located, things like that. And then I think beyond that, those are the main methods you tend to see. Sometimes we will also throw in a point-based or merit scoring process as well, which those can be particularly elaborate. So those are the big things you have to initially think about when you're drafting. And some of them require a lot of specialized review and consultation.
Cool, thanks, Jessica. And I think one of the things we'll want to get to a little bit later is the point-based system. And, you know, if you're going to set up a competitive application process, what the pros and cons of that are.
Please don't.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your sort of expanded thoughts on that. Next, I'd like to go to Jackie. And Jackie, sort of a similar question, right? Are there any initiatives that you have your eye on that you think may be particularly consequential? And also, more generally, as you've seen initiatives take shape, are there things that folks have done wrong on taxes or say other issues that are worth raising?
Sure. There is not a shortage of tax initiatives on this November's ballot, which is a good sign because that's usually the precursor to a jurisdiction regulating. It is really important to know that you want to be involved in the process when they are deciding what rate to set the tax at. So getting involved very early in one of these cities, if you're hoping to open up any kind of business there, is really going to be key to your survival. Once the tax rate is set, and most of these, are an up to that you're voting on, so it's giving the council the wiggle room to start low or start high, wherever they wanted to go, but also giving them the ability to adjust it should it not be effective. So it's important to be involved in that process because once the tax rate is set, it is really, really difficult to move. And what I found significant this year is Calaveras County has a tax initiative on the ballot. And Calaveras County already has a tax in place for cannabis. Those that are familiar with what happened in that county know that they had regulated and issued a bunch of permits, and then a new council came in and stopped that and made everybody illegal the following year. So this new council, and the board has changed again, this new council is aware of how financially strapped this jurisdiction is, and they're looking forward to regulating, and they've just started issuing some permits. But they went from having a gross receipts tax to switching it to a square footage tax. And that was because they got tired in their first attempt at regulating, they got tired of trying to prove how much weed was grown on these farms and then taxing them accordingly. So for a local jurisdiction that's really not trying to be involved in the every day-to-day business of a cultivation facility, it's a lot easier for them to make projections and to plug that number into a budget as they're making projections for the coming years. So that to me is very significant because Calaveras County said, you know what, we don't care how much product you actually grow. We'd rather just say, here's X amount, and then they can take that X amount and try and pay for some government programs with it.
Jackie, just a follow-up question. You mentioned how important it is to get involved early in the process. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like, right? So if you anticipate that your city might pass a tax measure, what does that involvement kind of look like? Is there a role for local communities in that process? And have you seen anyone do it effectively?
It depends on what avenue each jurisdiction chooses to regulate. If they go the very long, lengthy process, they're going to have multiple town halls where you're going to have the ability to, get up at podium in, a post-pandemic world anyway, get up at a podium and discuss as a community where that industry should, get started. If that's not an option in your jurisdiction, then emailing every one of your local elected officials and asking for a meeting is. Another way, if they don't respond to you to get involved, is to figure out what speaks to those council members, like what kind of charities they're involved in. And you start showing up at some of their events. And it's really hard for a council member to vote against you once they know you. And so it's very easy to vote against you if they don't know you. So you really want to get in there and you want to make, sure that they know who you are. And for me, I don't know, if I had a client that had about $100 million and I'm looking at that list of who's voting on taxes this year, I'd be saying, hey, there's probably a very good chance that Calabasas is going to pass a tax, and that would be an ideal location to have a dispensary. So that's where I would, be excited to go work in. No one's hired me to do that yet, but maybe after this.
Cool. Next, I'd like to go to Sean. And Sean, I have a question for you, although I'll also give you a chance to sort of introduce yourself. Earlier, Jessica was talking about lessons learned from the ballot measures she's been involved with down in San Diego County. I know that you have been involved in measures in the Bay Area, and I was hoping that you could speak to, different cities where you have been involved and will be involved, and also sort of touch on the tax question that Jackie was just talking through before.
Sure, thanks, Hirsch. Sean Kelly Rye, president of the Silicon Valley Cannabis Alliance. I apologize for being late, a little bit of a computer lack of understanding. But yeah, San Jose is one of the very first cities that we worked in and got an ordinance passed. Well, actually, we didn't get an ordinance passed. We tried to work it out with the council. We kept going back and forth. The council finally wanted to just create a moratorium, and we got together, we raised about $400,000. San Jose is a big city, so it requires a lot of signatures. Went out and had professional signature gatherers and volunteers go get the measure on the ballot. It qualified as Measure C. Once that happened, then the mayor and city council members realized, wait a second, we're gonna potentially lose this because we have a pretty liberal city, and we better come to the table and create some mechanism to allow cannabis in the city. And so that's how San Jose did it. It was more a hammer stick approach than it was anything else. But we always kept the lines of communication open, and we were always respectful. We ended up, the attorney that was actually running the ballot measure was James Anthony out of Oakland, which a lot of you know. James did a fantastic job, and we kind of played good cop, bad cop, and worked out a reasonable permitting system. We ended up with no cap on dispensaries at the time. It was really an issue of go find a property that qualifies and you will get your permit by right. There was no CUP process either. The council was very acutely aware that they don't want to fill up the council chambers at those times with a whole bunch of angry neighbors, and said, wait, the voters have already voted for this. We're just going to have to implement it. And that was the deal that we cut. Once we had that deal with the mayor and council, the participants in the measure actually went and raised money against their own measure. So the industry actually opposed Measure C that they put on the ballot, and it lost because you didn't even have the industry supporting it. One that's happening currently right now is San Bruno. San Bruno voted 3-2 against cannabis at their most recent meeting when they were hearing it about a year ago. They have a budget shortfall. I got a call from one of the council members, and he said, hey, I want some help with how to get some support for this. And we've been kind of having a conversation about how they can get it on the ballot. They're just going to do it via a council action, but kind of to what Jackie had said earlier, get engaged. Really get engaged with municipalities that are around you as an industry. They don't have information. They have so many things on their plate. They have traffic, they have housing, they have homelessness, they have budget shortfalls, they have anything and everything you can imagine under the sun. And then they have cannabis, and they're expected to be an expert. They don't know cannabis. In fact, they fear it. And where there's fear, you're going to have a bad outcome. So get in there, whoever you are that represents the industry, open a dialogue, talk about taxes, talk about how you're going to reduce the illegal market, the unlicensed market. Talk about all those positives that are going to happen because of it beyond the tax dollars that they're going to bring in. Engagement's probably the best way to do it. And then the initiative, we have used the initiative more as a hammer as opposed to any other sort of mechanism.
And you mentioned San Bruno, which I think is an interesting example. As many of us know, San Mateo County is a massive cannabis desert. And so I'm curious, what role do you think ballot initiatives can play in opening up retail? I think that's one of the reasons we're so interested in them. And I'm curious, how you think, how impactful they are compared to other efforts to open up retail across the state. I guess another way of putting this is, how ultimately consequential do you think this San Bruno ballot measure is going to be in November?
Well, the ballot measure in San Bruno is really about the tax, and they need help with that. They're going to look to how strongly does the tax measure pass for the tax, and that'll give them an indication of how well they want it. But overall, I tend to want to shy away from ballot measures unless I really know the outcome. You know, and Jessica can probably chime in on this also, is if you have a pretty good feel that that electorate is going to pass an initiative, then you have a whole lot of leverage. If you're going to go into a conservative municipality like Campbell and think that just because of the magnificence of cannabis, you're going to pass an initiative, that's wishful thinking. No, you better have really good polling. You better know who those voters are. You better have a really good strategy. This is an initiative. This is like getting somebody elected. It's just an issue versus a person. And so you better have all the right analytics, and you better put in the legwork to make sure that happens. And so I use the initiative process less frequently than I'd like. I'd rather sit down and have a conversation with elected officials and try to work out a deal that makes sense for everybody, and make them understand that cannabis is good for their economy and good for their city, rather than push initiatives. But I'm sure Jessica has input on that and that also.
Yeah, absolutely. Jessica, do you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, briefly, I would agree. If I could always have my perfect way, I would prefer to pass an ordinance through, you know, the council chamber or the supervisor chamber, with input from stakeholders, and work out what's best for every community. I do think that would be the best way to do it. I think at times with an initiative, when you can use them as a negotiating tactic, it has been done successfully, clearly. I think what you do have to be careful of is what Sean mentioned. Even when we have been in a position where we have ultimately decided, you know, negotiation is not going to work here, we need to run an initiative, there's a lot of merit in continuing to have a discussion with local staff and local electeds. One, they don't enjoy being blindsided. Two, they can at times offer very valuable input about what tax language, what regulatory, et cetera, is going to be a good fit for the area, what they've done with other things. And that can play a large role not only in how your campaign goes. If you have local electeds actively campaigning against you, it's a huge downside. But also, even if you win, even if they really don't want you there and you show up to submit applications, even if you think you've done a perfect job, they can make your life and application process a living hell, and just dismantle you every step of the way. It has happened. I have lived through it. I don't recommend it. So I think there's always an advantage to having good communication in that way. And sometimes too, they're just some electeds too. They're not anti-cannabis, but in addition to having a lot of other things to do, they feel more comfortable with the idea of a reasonable measure that the local residents vote on, and then they decide: do we want this? Do we not? And they don't necessarily want to be the ones, because as you said, cannabis is scary, to make that leap. They would prefer the voters make a direct decision. We've gotten that feedback as well.
Something that's interesting that we've seen lately is we're currently in a situation where we were looking at an initiative in a city. We gathered quite a bit of signatures before COVID. And now we're going back to council members that were anti-cannabis, and we're telling them, hey, we have more signatures for this initiative than you actually won with last time you were elected. Mm-hmm. So let's have a dialogue, because we can now, because we have their information, send them mailers or talk to them and say, don't vote for this person. And so there's always that leverage also to change the council or the supervisorial composition. And you know, politicians are always aware of who's voting for them. That they know. They may not know cannabis and they may not know a whole lot of everything else, but they know who's voting for them. And therein is the leverage also. And so, you know, I've always seen it as a last resort, but as a very effective leverage tool for, you know, a citywide sort of cannabis ordinance, or more so, very strategically targeting anti-cannabis elected officials. And they're receptive. I mean, we literally have more votes or signatures on this cannabis initiative than this person was elected with last time. It's a small town, so they only had maybe almost 4,000 votes in their favor. And they're going to look at that and say, wait a second, I'm in a general election, presidential year. Donald Trump has, there was an article I saw in the Marijuana Moment that Donald Trump is now telling Republicans, don't put cannabis tax measures or any other measures on the ballot because it's hurting Republicans. And so he's looking at the down ballot races along with him also. So the elected officials are going to be acutely aware that they don't want to be on a ballot with cannabis folks. It'll drive out an unknown voter that tends to lean left.
Thanks, Sean.
And also support your friends too. Don't just use it to threaten the bad guys. Please support your friends and find new candidates and give them a good issue. That's a nice thing too.
Totally. Next, I'd like to go to Sabrina, but before I do that, I just wanted to note that, I think we got a really good question from Adam in the chat regarding, sort of organizations that can help craft good cannabis ordinances. I know many people on this panel have experience with that, so I think I'd like to get to that in a second. And if other people have questions, please feel free to drop them in so we can get to them. But with Sabrina, what I'd like to talk through is, we've talked a little bit about the role these ballot initiatives can have in opening up cities. But would love your take on other things we should be paying attention to. In many of these cities that are open, a number of businesses themselves are not succeeding. And so we know opening up more cities in and of itself won't be sufficient. I'm hoping you can speak to what you see as the main challenges and place where advocates can push for better policy.
Sure. Well, I would say in general, when you're talking about the whole system of ballot measures, it's the history of ballot measures of a general social laboratory, and by their very nature become sort of a hodgepodge of policies that are made up by local cities. So it's sort of set up to create this system of chaos, if you will. I would use an example of Berkeley really quickly, who has gone through multiple variations of ballot measures throughout the years, starting in, Measure JJ in 2008, which allowed dispensaries, and then Measure S, more specifically, which was about Proposition 19, and included the 10% adult use tax that was supposed to specifically be for Prop 19, but turned out the way that it was written, it applied to Proposition 64 as well. And so that meant that the 10% tax that was voted on in an earlier version of legalization initiative that did not consider the additional taxes that was included in Proposition 64 was then included into this new system, which became, we saw very early, very much unsustainable. And so, been having a lot of discussions about the impacts of all of this, and there's a lot of tax measures on the ballot, but I think that we need to think about what are the frustrations that we're dealing with right now, currently, and that is the thriving illicit market, the struggling legal industry, and that includes the whole supply chain. We all have our own issues, but I would say when we're talking about expanding the market, we have to think of the economic considerations and the consumers. We know that there is a demand for cannabis in California. It exists. There were a lot more dispensaries prior to 2018. And so we know that that market's getting served somewhere. Clearly, they're not getting served in the legal market, into the legal retailers. We're not at maximum capacity. So, and the reason for that is the cost comparison. It's a lot cheaper to get unregulated product on the illicit market. And so when you're adding all of these taxes on, and it makes sense. I mean, the cities want that revenue and need that revenue. But when you're competing with this illicit market, you have to consider if you're going to be able to capture more of those customers. And I'm worried that we're going to see a situation where there's a lot more retail licenses and not a lot more customers. So when shaping these regulations and these measures, I think it's really important to consider both the current environment of the legal industry in California, but also what it's going to look like in the future and what it's going to look like under federal legalization. If these cities really want to incentivize businesses, when you're looking at federal legalization and your business can go anywhere, majority, unless you have that sort of California theme, Appalachian specific product, it's going to be much cheaper, highly likely. I mean, it's pretty much inevitable. It's going to be much cheaper to go somewhere else, either in the state or out of the state or out of the country. So, and how those dynamics and those relationships are going to change between the supply chain, I think is also very, very important. And it's hard to anticipate exactly what's going to happen and how this is going to unfold, what it's going to look like in the future. But when my concern is when we create such tight restrictions or such a tight framework that is not very fluid or moldable to changing environmental factors, then it's going to end. A lot of cities are going to end up in a situation where they're not able to adapt and compete properly in a larger market. So, a lot of concerns.
Sabrina, where do you see, where are advocates best positioned to move the needle on the tax question? Is it at the local level? I mean, you were citing some local examples. We've heard for a long time about attempts to simplify and reduce taxes at the state level. That hasn't gone anywhere. Where should all of us, you think, be directing our efforts?
I think for the purposes of consistency, since the local situation is just, there's no way that we're going to be able to get anything consistent across a bunch of local governments. So the focus, in my opinion, needs to be on the state level and reducing taxes on the state level, cultivation, excise, preferably both, preferably all of it. But I think that that's sort of general overarching relief, and especially because the excise tax and these other taxes are included in other tax calculations. You have this compounding tax situation happening. And so, everyone can get behind the state lowering the taxes. Not everyone can get behind, they can get behind every other municipality doing its thing, but it's so diverse that we're sort of diluting our efforts by focusing on our own little fiefdom and not going to the main source, the head of the snake that can really have the larger impact across everybody.
Absolutely. Sean, I was wondering if you could actually speak to that same question. So Sabrina was making the case about how important it is to reduce taxes at the state level, which is definitely true. I think you've been involved in some efforts to reduce taxes locally, and I'm curious what approach you took and how you found it to be effective and what the impact has been.
Yeah, I'm a proponent for, if you have more retail, you will have more cities that will do it, and more cities doing it will create competition, and that will reduce the tax rate. Redwood City, HDL Companies is running that process or assisting in that process. They've been looking at cannabis since 2017, 2018. They have delivery license right now, and they're in the process of allowing storefront. Their process should be open in November. They're looking at a tax rate between 4% and 6%. During the study session on August 24th, the council asked HDL where they think they should probably be, and they said start at 4. Right, let's start there and see where we want to go from there. If it's higher, if it's lower, they can go anywhere between 0 and 10. San Jose has stayed at 10 because there's no one around them to drive the tax rate down. So I think you need more jurisdictions with more retail, and those jurisdictions will compete, and that competition will drop the tax rate. San Jose's reluctance has been purely because there's no one between San Jose and Hollister and San Jose and San Francisco, with a lower tax rate. So why? You either come to San Jose and pay the tax rate or you don't. And slightly to the point that Sabrina had made, I think that the more retail, the better. I'm not that worried about dispensaries that are not making $10 million a year. Some of those are my clients, so no offense to any of those people. But I grew up in a family where my father owned a liquor store that made $300,000 a year in a good year, and sent us to college and afforded sort of a middle class lifestyle. And I don't know why we need monolithic stores in cannabis and call that an effective fair market. You want people of color, you want black and brown, you want women, you want, any one of the, minority groups to be in this industry. More retail everywhere. Give everyone a fair shot to make money. And then those that are good will win. Those that are not good will, go work for someone else. I mean, it's really that simple. Let the market figure out where it needs to be. I mean, the voters voted for it. And, you know, in Redwood City, HDL proposed 1 per 10,000 as far as licenses. I like that. I'm fine with that. Yeah, that sounds like a lot. The voters voted for it. You know, let people push back on that idea. Redwood City's looking at anywhere between 0 and 6 dispensaries. Staff has said, you know, closer to 6. Let's do, and Redwood City's population is 68,000. So they're looking at 1 per 10,000. I think that's a fair metric. I saw that in the chat, somebody had asked about, you know, Orange County, do 1 per 10,000. I mean, it's not that hard. Good guys will do well. Bad operators won't do well. That'll be the market. Taxes will equalize because cities will be forced to compete.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. I agree in principle with that. And yes, obviously, the more, as much retail as possible, it's certainly more than we have right now. But when you're talking about giving everyone a shot at this, the playing field isn't really fair from the beginning, because a lot of these ordinances and measures, the way that they're set up is sort of, you have to, I mean, when they say high barrier to entry, that's what they mean, is the licensing process, and even just getting through that. And I think that bringing down some of these requirements, which come with both changing perceptions of cannabis and thinking that they're not so dangerous, and the stigma behind that, and treating them more like normal businesses. I mean, if I wish that cannabis was treated like any other business, I think we would be in a much better position. But, you know, we can open, I mean, I guess it remains to be seen if, you know, the people that do make it through these application processes 2 years later get their dispensaries open. And hopefully in 2 years, I mean, maybe the market is different, maybe the environment is different, and things have changed. I mean, really, who knows at this point, or anything can happen. But I just think that the illicit market is thriving. It's so strong that it's not going to be it's not going to have the outcome that a lot of people will be expecting, having put in as much money that they will be to get a license and to get started. I think that's that point right there. If you can get past that early growing pain stage, if you can get past the application process and the growing pain stage, and survive through all of that, then yeah, I guess all of this remains to be seen.
On that note, I personally, I don't agree with caps. I don't agree with population ratios. I actually would like to let the market sort it out. I also agree that the cost to consumer is a major problem right now for licensees. And I actually am at times less concerned with the cost of getting through the initial process, although I think we do need to talk about that, and we do need to lower that barrier for entry. What I am more concerned about as part of that, though, is overly restrictive zoning and limitations on the number of licensees, particularly in retail. And what we have inadvertently created, and some jurisdictions have inadvertently created, is sometimes when I'm feeling sarcastic, we've managed to make a group of people incredibly wealthy. They're called landlords. It's only some landlords. It's landlords who are fortunate enough to own property that meets the magical zoning. For instance, where I am in the city of San Diego, or I live near the city of San Diego, we have a cap, we have a limit per council district, and we have very restrictive zoning, only certain zones, a lot of distance buffers. And as a result, landlords have been and will continue to be able to charge an off the charts premium. Yes, getting through the process is expensive. Construction is expensive. Complying with all sorts of rules is very expensive. But if you are handing over just an astronomical percentage of your monthly gross in rent, we're all familiar in California with the cost of housing. It's like if you're an individual, you know, the old rule about paying only a third of your income in rent just doesn't work for most people here. Well, it doesn't work for most cannabis retailers either. And I think that if you lower the zoning restrictions, if you lower the caps, eliminate them preferably in my book, if you make it so that, hey, I'm not stuck here forever. I could go over there and talk to that landlord. He seems like a nicer guy. Or I could go talk to that lady. She's got a great spot. I mean, I would love to live in a world where I have landlords competing with each other and offering incentives and cooperation and things like that to get a client in. And along that same token, I am also a little tired and want to shift the dialogue. And I think Sabrina was alluding to this. I am tired of the idea that cannabis retailers are a blight, that they are something to be tolerated in exchange for almost the blood money that we offer. I'm tired of it. The truth is, you bring them in, they increase foot traffic, they revitalize downtown areas, they bring people in, they make the blocks safer with increased security measures, bringing people in, greater activity. I mean, honestly, the number one complaint is parking half the time. That's a good problem to have. But it's just, if you make it so expensive that you're having to spend just astronomical sums while you're going through the permitting process and when you're operating in your rent every single month, and yeah, it's always going to be a big expense, but if it's just dwarfing you, that's not going to work either. And it's not, you cannot just expect landlords to be nice. You cannot expect them to say, oh, you seem like a good guy, or you've got a great background, or you're someone that society should give a chance to. No, I'm sorry, that's not how they work. They want to make as much money as they can. So what do? You need increased competition among landlords. So you got to lower those zoning barriers. Hirsch, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Jessica, you mentioned a few factors, zoning, right? Caps, the ability to move. And I think that dovetails nicely with the first question that we've gotten from the audience, from Adam. And what he asks are, what are organizations that effectively advise cities on cannabis ordinances? He mentioned HDL, which Sean also mentioned in his answer. And, this is sort of just an open question for the group. Are there consulting firms out there that you see as helping cities prepare ordinances that are free of a lot of these challenges? If not, where do you think these ordinances are most efficient, and how can the industry play a role in pushing that? I mean, one example I'll just throw out there for the group's consideration is Fairfield is about to authorize retail. It's 120,000 people, and they're going to issue 2 storefront licenses, right? Some people see a recipe for disaster there. So I'm curious, without bashing any organizations, right? Where have we seen some of these firms do well, fall short, and what role can the industry play in pushing for more rational ordinances?
So I think Sean should probably answer that because he's got more experience with a lot of these organizations. But before we get to that, I really just want to jump in and give the audience a couple of tidbits that there are at least two, it might be 3, and I don't really know if we can count Crescent City yet, but there are 2 jurisdictions in the state that have an open process regarding retail. And that is the city of Lompoc and the city of Palm Springs. And so these 2 I'm hoping, because they've had an open process for retail, meaning if you find a compliant property, you can have a dispensary. There's no competitive process and there's no cap. The availability of commercial real estate is really what's driving the industry, which industry representatives are opening there. But these 2 cities really should be studied to see how many end up opening up and if any of them end up closing, and what those business models look like inside those cities, because this is different than anything else that's happening across the state. We've got caps in every other jurisdiction. So uncapped areas and, led by Republicans are, it could be a case study. What kind of revenue are they bringing in? How many are open? How many people are they seeing a day? Are they able to get the price down for the consumer because of the competition? These are really interesting things, but also I just want to let the audience know that, there are 2 places that you're not going to have to go through the competitive process if you can find property there. And now it's your turn, Sean.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure or not the pleasure or just the experience of working with a number of consulting companies. And I think there's been an evolution, right? When it first came out, I think after the Prop 64 first passed, I think that these consulting companies thought that they only work for the municipality and that is the greater good. and that sort of they're at the behest of the taxpayer. And so maximize, 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 not realizing that the negative impact that they're going to have on the industry. And so you saw tax rates at 10% or even above. You saw cultivation taxes really too high. You saw very restrictive zoning. Lots of hurdles to go through the processes. But I think it goes back to education. Every time I get an opportunity to talk to Neil at SCI, or Dave McPherson, or Tim Cromartie over at HDL, or anyone over at Muni Services, I talk to them. And it's always the same. I always start with the same thing, which is, let's make sure the tax rate is low, right? The whole intent here is to legalize and shift it away from the illegal market. And you're not going to do that if you're going to ratchet up taxes. My second point is always, please give us the maximum number of properties possibly available in the city. Don't just shoehorn us into industrial. Don't just put us into, say, retail. Don't put us into some special use district. Don't force us to get CUPs. Let us go into a specific area by right, like a coffee shop or anyone else that would go into a specific location. Treat us like all other businesses, but I think there's been an evolution with a lot of these consulting firms, is that they're realizing that they're not just serving one master, is they better have a successful program. And if you're going to have high taxes, high barriers to entry, restrictive zoning, your outcome is going to be poor. So why would another community really hire you as their consultant? Great, you created a program that's failed. So I think they've finally figured out that there's got to be a balance between the industry and the city. And now the consultants that I've been dealing with, I mean, I to be honest with you, I was a little bit shocked that HDL chose 4% over 6% when given the option in Redwood City in an open discussion, right? Then the prior tendency would have been, these are the people that are paying me, I'm going to go with 6 because that's going to make the council happy. But that was not the mind shift. The mind shift was, we're trying to regulate this industry, get it out of the illegal market where they're selling to people that are minors or anyone else, and delivering in bad places or what have you, and try to shift it over to the legal market. And so there's been that evolution. It hasn't been easy. Like I said, I would love to see more licenses in more jurisdictions, and that greater competition. And Jessica's 100% right. Even at 1 per 10,000 is restrictive. If an area, if an area warrants it, there should be more, right? The consumer will figure out where they want to go, right? We don't limit gas stations or Starbucks or any of that stuff. So why are we really doing that here in this industry? You're just artificially controlling it. So the consultants have evolved, which is really good. So my and like I said, it's I think with a lot of it, you're educating council members, and you should be educating those consultants along the way, and you should be telling them, listen, these are the challenges we're facing in the industry now. Look at our perspective on things. Really engage these folks over and over and over. When on my organization, we had a panel session not long ago, and we had Dave McPherson on, and people got to ask him tough questions. And what are you doing about this? What are you doing about it? Engage them, get them involved, make them realize they're not on one side of the fence or the other, but they're on both sides of the fence, and they've got to listen to what we have to say, and not just kind of do what's in their mind. So it's worked in some cases. In other cases, it hasn't. But that's kind of the fight we are having on a regular basis.
And sorry, Jessica, do you want to say something?
I would just say I think that I think we are going to see consulting companies. I think that personally, I have seen the best results with either an initiative that was done by people with some legal and policy expertise, both at a municipal level and then also from a cannabis overall law and policy level. I have unfortunately found that some of the municipal consulting firms, you're right, education is huge. It's a curve. We're all always working on it. But I think that when you have the greatest problem in drafting, whether it's a consultant or a local government is when there is sort of outright hostility to one of two concepts. And one is the idea that, hey, these cannabis people might actually know something about this thing that we're trying to regulate, versus, I'm not interested in hearing about that. We don't want to hear from you. You just want it your way all the time. And also just the idea that you cannot ask questions, that there is not a give and take, that there is not a discussion process. I unfortunately went through a process recently where people had questions throughout the application process, and we were told we couldn't ask them to the city. We could not contact the outside company directly. There was just no way to get answers for a really long period of time on some very important questions. There was no forum, there was no email, there was no nothing. It was bad, and we wound up with results that really didn't make anybody very happy, not applicants, not the local electeds. So I think that however it comes about, and personally, I think you get the best results with a collaboration with all stakeholders and local staff, government being involved in the actual drafting. I think support is great. I don't think they should just listen to me or just listen to Sabrina or just listen to Sean. I think they have to listen to a lot of people and incorporate that. That's how you get the best results. But you get the best results with dialogue, not with a closed box.
Earlier in the conversation, I think a few of you were talking about the relationship between barriers to entry and equity, and how reducing those barriers can help build a more equitable industry. And we're starting to get a few questions and comments about barriers to entry. Dana, for instance, mentions that in Stanton, there's a $100,000 deposit that's required to submit an application, which sounds like a pretty big barrier to entry. And Sam is asking the question, how can we change our ordinances effectively to lower the barriers to entry on a local scale? So question for anybody, have you seen efforts to, I think Jackie was alluding to this a little bit earlier, but have you seen efforts to modify ordinances to reduce the barriers to entry, or cities that have been very conscious about this in order to build more equitable local industries?
Well, I can start with Berkeley. Berkeley's always been very socially conscious, but they recently passed, I guess this must have been over a year ago, pre-COVID, added a 7th equity license type to their license cap. Yeah. And that was a long process. And it was unfortunate though, because it was just one license, which doesn't really do much to help like an entire community that's been disenfranchised, but they spent a significant amount of time on it. And it actually turned out to be a good thing, because they informed me that they were planning to use this model as a citywide model for all industries in the city. And it was sort of to, cut the license application fee, provide training services. The city engaged all of us and called us and asked us about like what sort of HR programs would be a good service the city could provide for potential employees. And it was this really, it's BPG and the city of Berkeley and the cannabis industry have had a very good relationship for 20 years. And it's just a really good example, I think, for everyone else to look at is how crucial and important that relationship is, and continuing that dialogue that now we're having, like people from the economic development department reaching out to us and asking us, what do you think would be good for a program that we're creating? And so it's like everybody on this panel has said, it's consistent engagement and education, and then finally consolidation of thought.
I'd like to jump in. We did see a very conservative county take a look at how they had regulated just a couple months ago and decided to lower the barrier to entry a little bit. And Riverside County had a competitive process. They issued some licenses, and then not everybody opened. So I think that we should be seeing more jurisdictions move in a direction like that as they're getting nervous about not having revenue. I think that was motivated by COVID, and financial insecurity. And I'm hoping that continues. But there's a question in the chat from Adam about what passed in Pacific Grove last night. And I think we need to work with Sean on how he got that by right ordinance passed and figure out how we can replicate that and start educating people about that process. This is brand new to me. And encouraging people to offer that as a faster remedy to getting open, I guess. I don't know, Jessica might know better than me if that's a contentious topic with cannabis. I've never had that by right discussion, but if that's going to get businesses open quicker, and you know, that is exactly what we need to do regarding lowering the barrier to entry.
Well, it's a little tough to have, I'm just cards on the table. I'm not familiar with what Pacific Grove passed last night, but an issue with by right, while it can be awesome, if you have to really look out for two issues. One is that the ordinance or the municipality is dealing with CEQA review. You have to have some form of CEQA review or exemption or environmental document, depending on your use and your circumstances. With retail, we've generally had it been deemed exempt or fallen into one of the exceptions. So it's not too bad, but you're best off if your local government addresses this in some fashion, because otherwise you're going to have to address it in your state application, and that could add a lot of delay. But one challenge of by right is not only making sure you adequately address CEQA, but also if you have a cap or a restrictive number, by right very quickly turns into everyone sleeping outside the city like they're waiting to buy Metallica tickets back in the 80s. No, really, it will go on for weeks. I'm not joking. I have seen it. You can get around these issues with a lottery system, et cetera. But by right sounds great, but when you cap a number, you have to be careful about that. They have to put some thought in, because otherwise, I swear to you, people are going to start sleeping out there next week.
The good thing that I've experienced with allowing it by right is usually the municipalities taking the work and front loading it on themselves, which is great. So the applicant, that's kind of another reduction of the burden that's put on the applicant. And then it's just kind of easier to find property. In Redwood City, I'll give you a perfect example. They're going to allow retail by right in retail zoning. We're also trying to include some of the industrial zoning below a specific square footage. So it gives us even more potential parcels to choose from because it's a small city. But if you found a reasonable retail location with adequate parking, and that serves whatever business model you have, then that property's good as long as you meet the sensitive receptors for the state, which is what they approved or they're going to approve. It makes it so much easier. In San Jose's model, the reason they actually passed it is, frankly, in our conversations with the mayor, the voters already voted for this. They don't want to fill the chambers with a bunch of people that are opposed to it, that tend to show up more than people that voted for it, and create a whole community outcry that's really one-sided and non-existent. When you have a city like Mountain View that voted 68% for Prop 64, and then 100 people show up in opposition, they're only representing the 32% that voted against it. And the problem is that they're disproportionately sort of creating this narrative that's not real. So I think councils are getting smart to the issue of voters voted for it. These are probably the appropriate areas to put it in. Let's just do it that way. The side benefit for us as applicants is, or clients of ours that are applicants, is there's less of a CEQA burden or less of a burden in general on them, and less of an application fee and going through all that time and effort. But then also for the city, they get to get them open sooner and get revenue going sooner. And that's great, which is a lot easier. And so I think that a lot of cities are now going that way. I think the consultants have also figured that out. Like, let's find more locations that we can actually plug and play cannabis dispensaries, as opposed to having them go through some lengthy CUP process or something even worse. a general
I think
plan.
another way to lower barriers of entry too would be to separate the property from the applicant and to give the applicant, allow them to put in their application and either through lottery or merit, but then you get chosen that way and you get a specific amount of time and maybe some aid to go find a property for a year. And if you can, if you can't find one within a year, then you pass that on to the next person, but then you don't have that pressure of running around and trying to put down all of these deposits, and you get time to kind of build some funding from investors because you have this license, but you just need a property. And so I think that would help set people up better that are struggling with the high barriers to entry right now.
Yeah, on that note, I think that, and it was interesting because we had a whole discussion where the group all talked about this, and the truth is, when this is another one of those things that can matter depending on where you are. For instance, some jurisdictions, they really do a lot of uses through a conditional use permit process. Uncapped uses, things that you wouldn't really think are all that big of a deal. In a large city, for instance, there are a lot of things permitted by conditional use permit, and they don't always go on and take forever, and they do not all necessitate a hearing before the city council. For instance, City of San Diego, we do it through a CUP process. There are things I would love to change, but our highest level of appeal is to our planning commission. Same with another city, La Mesa, that we got through with initiative. Sometimes you have to look at what is the norm for how you permit different uses where you are, and then try to be efficient. By right, I think, has a lot of merit. I don't think this should always be an overregulated use. But that's again, where knowing your local government, knowing how they work, having that dialogue is going to be very important. Personally, I think that, again, sometimes there are certain jurisdictions where they may care more about the applicant and their plan than location. In Southern California, we are very obsessed with development in general, with locations and where you are. And I think that by right can work, but you either need to not limit the number, or if you're going to limit the number, I personally favor a modified lottery where you have to meet some initial standards, whatever they are, and then they draw out from there. It's not perfect. It's not maybe even what I would do in a perfect world, but it avoids people going through these multi-year processes of not knowing if they're even going to get approved. One other comment on merit-based or point-based systems. I really do understand their intoxicating appeal. Local jurisdictions love them because they love the idea that they're going to get the best people, however they may be defining that. And goodness knows there's a lot of ways to define it. And I have also found that clients and applicants love it because, everyone likes to think that they're the best, or they're going to put something together. And to be less cynical, yes, there is merit to the idea of there are certain objectives or things that you may want to promote. I think we all have broader policy goals that we bring to our work in this space. I think cannabis in particular, people bring that. The problem with them, in my view, is number one, they are very expensive and they take an incredibly long time. They are also very prone to being overly subjective and creating issues. And while I do think that we do need to talk about lowering barriers to entry to have a more diverse, and I mean that in all sorts of ways, perspective. And of course, we also need to talk about ordinances that disqualify people for all sorts of past convictions and issues and problems. It goes way beyond past convictions for cannabis, how this can play out. And we do need to talk about that. And we do need to talk about access to capital, the most equitable way to accomplish that beyond lowering barriers to entry. I'm very leery of point-based, merit-based systems, because inevitably what you wind up with is a lot of people making a lot of promises that they may or may not be able to bring through. The other problem with them from a drafting perspective is a lot of times it gets very general, very undefined. And that makes it really a very random process that at times I feel it's sort of, well, they had the biggest applications and the most pieces of paper, so I guess they're the best. I also get uncomfortable when I start getting feedback from other people on the team of, oh, well, this council member really loves this particular cause. Therefore, we have to talk about all the money we're going to donate to it. Well, at some point I start to feel like, is this really about the merit of the business and creating opportunity, or am I more trying to, I feel like I'm filling out the dating profile from hell. It's just, I don't like how subjective and throwing things and seeing what sticks at the wall they get very quickly. And I don't think ultimately I haven't seen one yet that always accomplished the goals that we wanted. I'm not saying we can't build a better process. I'm sure we can, but I think that a lot of thought has to go into how you craft that process. And unfortunately, then all that time and all that thought can really delay people. And I know it's a way more complicated story. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but one thing that has just broken my heart about watching the city of Los Angeles' process is how long the very people that we all hoped the process would help have been waiting and waiting and waiting as they've tried to figure out how to do it. I know it's more complicated than that, but those processes are always really prone to that flaw.
Cool. I know we're over time. I think we have time for one last quick question that I want to ask from the chat. And this is from Sam. I think a lot of what we've been discussing today is, what are different ordinances that have worked and not worked? What are the elements to have and avoid? And Sam is asking, how can we, or is there a database that houses all of the different approaches that cities have taken that cities can use as a resource to develop more rational policies? I think Sean mentioned that a lot of cities don't have the information that they need. So if anyone knows of resources or has a recommendation about how we can arm cities with that information, would love to hear it.
Panoregs is a great resource for that. That's the one that comes to mind first. Shout out to Amanda, she's watching.
If there's a model out there that you want them to look at, that you want to copy, that you think has good pieces you've read about, hey, these are local governments. They have to post their ordinances and regulations and things online. They're public record. They're almost always even online. And if for some reason they're not, I suppose you could file a Freedom of Information Act request, but I haven't generally found that to be necessary. So if you've heard of one that's really good, if one is recommended to you, you should be able to find it and pull it and present it to the person that you're trying to talk to.
I was really hoping we could end with the last question, which says, which jurisdictions got it wrong? Because I really want to hear my panelists' answer to that one. My answer would probably be Pasadena, because it's still going on. Everyone's suing each other, and I've never seen a city sue itself before. So that's a giant mess. But I really want to know from my co-panelists, like, what their thoughts are.
That's a no-brainer. I mean, LA. Come on. I mean, really? Let's just drive everybody into poverty by making this massive process and punishing people with lawsuit after lawsuit, and hurt the people that we're supposed to help the most. I mean, and they've still got a massive illegal market. They've accomplished nothing. I mean, I can totally see why LA wanted to be excluded from the BCC altogether way back when they were doing the whole, MacUrsa, BCC, Prop 64 conversation. LA really is its own country or island or universe or something.
Public.
I agree with that, LA.
Jessica?
I can't disagree. I think LA has come to encapsulate a lot of issues. I think in general, most jurisdictions that have gone down the incredibly elaborate point-based system route, I think have often made a mistake. I think it has cost them a lot of money, even if they're not paying it directly. It certainly has sucked up time and left a vacuum for unpermitted operators to come in and fill, and it just takes longer and longer. And also, the more complicated you make anything, the more can go wrong with it. And you can't simplify everything to the point of fill out 2 forms. I mean, I've also had my frustrations with applications that basically say, tell us everything in the world about how you're going to track everything and onboard your employees and do this. And, oh, by the way, you have 150 words, have at it. It's like college application essays or something, or bad tests. You can't do it. But so I think the more we try to accommodate, how do we make this fit this local area and its needs and the best uses in the area? You know, not every jurisdiction is built for outdoor growing, for example. Some jurisdictions just don't really have agricultural land. So for them, we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Some places don't really have a lot of industrial land. We deal with that a lot down in Southern coastal California. Number two, how do we make this as relatively simple as we can from a zoning perspective, from a reasonable tax perspective, and all of that? And that conversation has actually gotten easier because we do now have massive state regulations and rules to follow and people checking up on us. And then I think lastly, how do you move as relatively quickly as possible? Because local jurisdictions, they want cash now. I keep thinking of those late night commercials. And my clients want to open now. Consumers want to buy legal cannabis now. So let's try to not have a process that takes 2 years. Let's try to do the best of by right, the best of a modified lottery if we must cap. And above all, let's make zoning a lot simpler and easier, because you will make it easier for people who don't have as many resources. You will make this go faster, and you will make it easier for people to turn a profit and also to eventually have lower pricing. Consumer taxes and all that is number one, but the cost of land is tremendous, and it is an ongoing thing that just kills clients.
If there's probably small cities that have gotten it wrong, I would say generally it's the small cities that have restricted the zoning. You take a small city that already is small and has very little inventory, and then you make it even smaller with sensitive receptors and a very restrictive zoning, and you end up with, no dispensaries and 2 or 3 years that go by because nobody can find a property. I mean, that may change post-COVID because now there are actually vacancies in some of these cities, but where small cities got it wrong was those small cities that had overly restrictive land use policies and effectively kind of killed it because there's nowhere to go. They've awarded licenses, but no one has anything that they can actually go into. So generally speaking, that's where small cities have probably got it wrong.
Cool. I think we're about time. Maybe one last thing that I'll add that we didn't get a chance to talk about today, but maybe in the future, is just development agreements. I think there are some small cities that are using those agreements to build really rational policies and get them off the ground quickly. But thanks so much, everyone, for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you, of course, to all of our panelists.